They've slowed down to a trickle rather than a wave. So why don't we get going? And so I'm Nigel Wilcock. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Economic Development. Thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar. So it's going to be led by Damian Walne from AECOM, and Dave Widger is also currently on the panel, who is a board member of the IED. And certainly the IED is absolutely delighted that AECOM came up with this, I think, extraordinary interesting title and this idea of how we're going to spend the next hour and a half, just in case there's a change of government or a change of party running the country in a few months' time. I think it's good to understand what's going on from all sides. So we'll get underway very shortly. Just a couple of announcements from the IED, though. So firstly, for those of you who are interested and haven't engaged with it yet, we'll start a new year of our professional development courses, both the Certificate in Economic Development and the Advanced Certificate in Economic Development. They'll start in January. So for those of you who are looking to get more out of your IED membership and undertake more CPD, then we'll start the new program in January, and you can sign up on our website. So we'd be delighted to see anybody that's interested on that. On the 11th of December, for those of you who are members, you'll have had a notice and you'll no doubt get a reminder, but please do put a slot for half an hour in your diary for our annual general meeting, which is in the afternoon. It will be held online. So keep a watch out for the appointments for that, but obviously important. And for those of you who aren't members of the IED, then please do consider joining. We're growing pretty rapidly, and we're delighted with everybody that comes to join us and gets involved. So please do consider that as well. AECOM are organisational partners of the IED. Very pleased to work alongside them, and we were delighted when they suggested to run this afternoon's webinar. So that's enough from me. I'll completely hand over the reins to Damian.
Yeah, thank you, Nigel, and thanks for letting us host this webinar. I'll just briefly introduce myself, and then maybe Dave will want to say hello as well. Yeah, I'm Damian Walne. I'm in the Regional Director in the Economic Development team at AECOM in London. I've been with AECOM since January. Before that, my career's been more kind of a mix of transport and urban economics in local government, civil service, and various consultancies, and most recently with National Highways. But before I power on the slide deck, I'll let Dave say hello to you.
Yeah, hi, Dave Widger, Head of Economics at AECOM and also board member of the IED, and keen, I think, to just obviously talk about this in the context of what's happening, or well, very much in terms of what's happening today, but also what the IED are also doing from an economic development perspective.
Okay, thanks. Well, thank you for joining us and giving up some of your time today to listen to this. I'm thrilled so many people signed up. I think we've got 90 participants on the call, which is great, and it shows us a lot of interest in this topic. I think it's kind of a case at the minute of managing expectations too, because we don't necessarily have all the answers of what a new government may do, but we kind of certainly felt in our economic development team at AECOM that it's possible, maybe likely, there could be a change in government, the party in government, and we need to prepare for that because it's likely to affect what we do, and we expect that's true across the whole membership of the IED too, whether you're in consultancy like us, whether you're in a council or a public body, or you're in a developer, then policy matters and big changes in policy may happen if a new government comes in. And IED is a safe space and a forum to think about that and talk about that. So we're not here with an inside track on what a future government may do. It's kind of share our thoughts, and we could tell you what we've looked at, and perhaps in some of the discussion Q&A later to learn some of yours. Because the very nature of working economic development usually means we're interested in politics and public policy, or we need to be interested in for our work. So hopefully this slide deck will work, and you can all see the slides. So the UK general election is due to be held no later than January 2025. So it could be more than a year away, but we don't really know when it will be. There's no longer a fixed term Parliament Act. So it could be any time before then. It's the decision of the current Prime Minister, which is currently Rishi Sunak, and will probably be when the general election is called. most political commentary is that politicians don't like elections in winter months when it's cold and it's dark, or in the summer when people are going off on holiday. So it may be kind of a either spring election, April, May time next year, or perhaps later in September, October. But either way, it's coming. I'm sure we'll all be off to vote and choose who will walk through those doors of 10 Downing Street. Now, this bit, I hope it works. I've never really used Slido before anyway, but we've been experimenting this morning and it seemed to work. I think you've got a choice how to access Slido here. You can either use your phones to cameras to read the QR code, and that should log you onto the Slido site. Or you can just, if you're on your laptops, just type in slido.com and type in that hashtag IED seminar, and hopefully this works. It's just a bit of fun, but hopefully it works to make it more interactive. And I think as we've got 94, that's perfect. I think Slido lets you have 100 participants, so you should all be able to get on it, have a go. But the question we want to ask is, what political party do you expect to form the UK government, next UK government? It's not necessarily who you want to be the government, that's different. It's kind of this time next year, who do you expect to be the government? I can't see how many people are voting, but I think there's a clear majority leaning towards expecting a Labour government at the minute. I don't know if you can. We can all see what I can see here, but it's yeah. There's about coming out over 90%, 93% of you on the call expect Labour to be forming the next UK government, which is probably why you're on this call. A few saying Conservative and a few saying, just a handful saying other, which maybe because you might think there'll be a coalition or perhaps another party we've not talked about. But that's roughly in line what we expected you to say, really, because that's why you're here. I think key thing is politics is never certain. We've all lived through a few general elections with interesting results and referendums and so on, but certainly the polling is the expectation there's going to be a Labour government. So that 90+% of you expect it to be actually puts you in line with what electoral calculus I've worked out from opinion polls, which is there's 96% probability of a Labour majority. And possibly, on the current opinion polls, a very substantial majority that would be bigger than Labour's win in 1997, which would put Keir Starmer firmly through the doors of 10 Downing Street. And I think that leaves the question for us: what does a change in government mean for what we do in economic development? That's the issue for today. It'll have all sorts of implications and all sorts of things, but what we're at is how does it affect our work? Part of the challenge is possibly that at UK level, these changes in government or party of government don't actually happen very often. I don't have an age breakdown of who's on the call, but we expect not many people have worked through that many changes. We've had Conservative-led government since 2010. That's 13 years. So there's probably some on the call who spent their entire working careers under Conservative governments. Some of you, like me, may have been around a little longer and worked under a Labour government and went through that 2010 transition to Conservative governments. But I expect there's not many here, including me, who were working in 1997 when we last had that change from Conservative to Labour. And I'd be interested to know if there's anybody in the call who's around in the 70s when there was a few kind of changes between parties then, if he was working in economic development then. So let's try Slido again and see, this is the big question, just to see your thoughts and get the kind of issues you're thinking of. What do you think that would mean for us working in economic development? Tell us what you think. Do you think it will make no change? Do you think it will make a big difference? Had any difference? Do you think it'll mean more money, less money? Oh yeah, especially this comes up as anonymous. I hope that's true for everyone. You can say it's chatting house rules here. Okay. A bingo card, I like that one. More uncertainty. Okay, just some people say not a massive amount of difference. It's kind of some interesting examples. Or more funding for local authorities. Are they coming through thick and fast now?
industrial strategy, more of a donut approach to economic development. I presume that means Kate Rayworth's donut economics, I guess. More regional approaches, positive, focus on community, heaven only knows. True leveling up and not just funding in blue seats. Hope for some more long-term thinking and stability. Greater focus on the 14 cities. So surprised more acronyms. I think that's inevitable. I think EU funding is an interesting one because obviously the world of European Regional Development Fund has changed a lot under the current government and so on, and social funds and lines on budgetary constraints, active travel, sustainability funding. Slide is quite nice. Obviously, some of the key themes emerging on the top: funding, change, spending, focus, and place. And fewer new policies, please. Yes, I suspect that's indicates all the initiatives we've had over the recent years, new targets, and economic development as a statutory service, IED manifesto. That's interesting too, and planning rules. Okay, that's a lot. A lot came through thick and fast. Oh, they still come. Not sure when to go on because they keep coming. More confusion, more capacity, and less need for consultants. Sadly, that's one to discuss. Does it mean more or less need for consultants? Okay, some great examples there. I think rather than keep HS3, possibly not had HS2 yet. Yeah. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide. But that's been some really interesting examples come through there, and all really useful insights. And the kind of thinking you had is probably similar to ours, and kind of what we're going to get from this session, because this is what we've done within the AECOM team. We've kind of tried to approach this in two ways. I have two thoughts. First, to think about what challenges a new government will actually inherit in terms of the economy and economic development in particular. I think some of your comments before were picking up on that. And second, we've dug into some Labour Party documents to kind of see the kind of thing, and speeches, see the kind of things that are being said as indications that are likely to happen. We'll put some key caveats and disclaimers on that. First of all, there's no published Labour manifesto yet, so can't exactly predict what will be in that manifesto, and we don't have a hotline to anybody in the Labour leadership or Keir Starmer's team to tell you exactly what's going on. Maybe some of you on the call too. That would be great. I think there's also that issue which is tricky to define economic development. That's the age-old issue, and how we separate that from everything else in the economy. So we've mostly kind of focused on the kind of things we work on in our team around business cases and growth funds and planning and impact assessments and so on. And we're working on transport and housing as issues. And we've also focused on England, as that's where most of our work is. But we recognise that maybe some on the call with interest in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, where there's different policy environments and the role of the governments and assemblies. And maybe you have issues on what a changing UK government may mean for those places. But overall, I think first of all, we'll focus that there will be challenges ahead. A new government, a new Labour government, isn't going to start with a blank sheet, and it's going to face some constraints. So I've had to think about what some of those main challenges and constraints maybe. I think these charts were done before today's autumn statement. I'm not quite sure that will change much, but I think we've got this big picture issue of stagnating UK economic growth. The economy hasn't been doing that great, really. Think tanks like the Resolution Foundation have coined terms like stagnation nation, and this kind of chart indicates what they're getting at. Because up until 2007-8, despite recessions and booms along the way, there was largely a steady rate of economic growth since the 1950s and that post-war era, where the economy over every few years got that bit bigger. Now, there's always different ways of measuring GDP and all those kind of issues, but there's that headline that real GDP per person today, 2023, isn't actually much more than it was in 2008. That trend has been broken. There's been that stagnation. And we could have a whole separate seminar on the possible causes, whether it's the financial crash 2008, the impacts of Brexit, the COVID pandemic. But that's a whole other theme, other issue. I think the key thing for us today is that what Labour will be inheriting is an economy that's not growing. And that's a very different set of circumstances from when the Blair Labour government came in 1997, where the economy was growing quite strongly. And that kind of stagnation has consequences on public sector finances. And again, we could have a whole seminar just on the economics of that. But the message for today is that public sector debt is now about between 90 and 100% of GDP. And that's about twice as high as it was back in 2009-10, which is when we were told there was no money left, as they always keep telling us. So that debt is growing, and obviously that period of low interest rates has also come to an end, where debt is now more expensive to service. And with that, there's been this kind of long-term decline in reduction in public spending, especially in the kind of themes that we're working in economic development, where things like health may have been more protected. Things like economic development haven't been as well protected, and funding to councils, local governments have been particularly hit. And there's that headline that in 2020, the funding from government to councils was about half what it was in 2010. And in practice, that's meant less funding for things like town centres, local regeneration, public housing, local transport services, and the kind of things that many of us are working in. So my slides seem to have stopped working. Can I move that forward? Oh, there we are. And when a new government comes in, I'm sure much of you like to say that economic development will be top of the list. There's going to be lots of competing priorities. So just a few examples here, but I'm sure you can all think of your own too. But there's issues around poverty, the cost of living crisis, housing costs and the implication of that sort of things like homelessness, the NHS and social care, and the needs of an aging population. Big challenges on climate change and the UK's role in reducing carbon and new energy sources. Problems in our railway industry, which have been affected by strikes and low investment for a long time, and increasingly in the water industry, and issues around sewage in rivers and so on. And all these kind of things will be competing for space with what we think of as economic development, or at least they will be influencing what economic development is likely to look like. They'll have to be tied in with these things. And alongside that, there's been a changing policy landscape. The world in 2023 is different than it was in 2010 when Labour were last in office. There's been the nameplates have changed the government departments. What was DCLG became DLUC. BIS and Department for Innovation, University and Skills, you may remember that. I kind of been absorbed into Department for Business and Trade and DFE. But more significant, the whole system of governance around economic development has changed. Labour's economic development in the 2000s, the noughties, was underpinned by regionalism, really. Regional development agencies and regional assemblies, government office for regions, with skills elements like learning and skills councils and the sector skills development agency. That's all gone and went some time ago, but moved towards more the world of metro mayors and combined authorities and business interventions through things like catapults and growth hubs. And with that, programs changed. Out went regional strategies, local area agreements, a new deal for communities. In came deals, city deals, growth deals, devolution deals, and zones like enterprise zones, free ports, investment zones, and competitive funds like the Regional Growth Fund, more recently the Levelling Up Fund. So I think the choice for an incoming government may be about to what extent it adopts the structures and programs of recent years, or does it try to return to the kind of system it had set up, Labour had set up before, or try and develop something new. And then while some things change, our thoughts are the more other things stay the same. In 2010 and probably every year between, we've been talking about things like regional rebalancing and levelling up, basically trying to understand the inequalities between different parts of the country, about the role of London and the southeast relative to the north of England and other areas, or about ex-industrial communities, mining towns, coastal towns, those forgotten places, and what economic development policy regeneration can do to reinvigorate them. And we can analyse the stats in different ways, but perhaps a persistent message is that the relative performance of places across England has been pretty persistent. And a league table of economic performance in 2010 would be similar to a league table in 2023. So let's try Slido one more time. This goes forward. What do you think an incoming government should do to address these challenges? What should be the priorities for a Labour government in addressing economic development? Just jot your thoughts down and see what on Slido and see what comes up. Or is that too hard a question? Or is Slido not working? Oh, have a strategy if it's working. Why screaming? Okay, devolution a good start. Simplified single funding pot. Okay, the theme of devolution's coming up a lot. Local authorities' revenue raising capabilities. Support innovation. City mayors. Better organise the machinery of government. Consistent longer term funding. That's one that we may come back to. Reform the planning system. Target connectivity. Oh, some good ideas coming up here. More focused approach to investment. I think that came up forward, isn't it, to make economic development a statutory function. Focus on green policies. Long-term economic plan. I'm sure you've heard that one. I'm sure you've heard that one before. And then climate and nature, address the climate and nature crises, the starting point. And longer term thinking. Again, Slido's helpful with picking out some of the key themes that are emerging there, of which devolution, funding, longer term growth. Yeah, so I think key themes around longer term funding and devolution seem to be coming out nicely. And then particular things like the shared prosperity fund and business growth. Can tell we've got an educated audience who think about this a lot. I think there's still a few more coming in. I'll just give it a bit more time if anybody's got any last final ideas. Oh, the Leeds tram, perhaps that's someone in West Yorkshire. And rejoin the EU. That would, I don't think our presentation will be going into that European policy too much. And slacken off the obsession with growth. Okay, thank you. Some great thoughts. Okay, I'll move on to the next one. Oops, so let me scroll down. So it's not letting me go on to the next slide. It's a bit annoying. Sorry about the IT problem. We can't seem to scroll down.
Okay, I may have to stop sharing a second and try and come back to it because it's not letting me scroll down. Oops. There we go. Sorry about the technical hiccups. I'm an economist, not an IT person, as you can tell. So beyond that, what we then did was look at the emerging Labour Party policy documents. And so these are examples of the things that we looked at in our team. Earlier this year, Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves published a useful paper on a new business model for Britain, which was kind of really insightful on her thinking. There's a late draft Labour Party industrial strategy, prosperity through partnership. And then there's the work Labour Commission from Gordon Brown and others on renewing our democracy, which touched on all kinds of important issues in devolution. And there's also the work Labour's done on these policy commission papers, 6 of them: A Green and Digital Future, Public Services that Work, Where Families Come First, Safe and Secure Communities, Britain in the World, and Better Jobs, Better Work. In some cases, there's quite a lot of nice detail in these. In others, it's a bit vague and quite hard to work out what the actual policy is. And we can't always be clear what of these things will be adopted as policy in an election manifesto and what are just current ideas. We've just tried to make the best sense of it we can. And I think you may have seen these, the Labour Party's focus on these five missions, which are likely to be the foundation of its manifesto and programme for government, about growth, clean energy, the NHS, crime and safety, and barriers to opportunity. All useful missions, and you can look at these and make an argument to that all of these will, to some extent, be part of economic development policy. And they give a flavour of the ambitions, but don't necessarily tell us what they actually do. So we also then look, so the 6 commissions, there's actually a helpful piece of analysis on the Labour List website, which kind of brought together the bullet points, if you like, from each of these 6 commissions about what Labour Party's policy platform will be on the October conference. And we tried to analyse it by putting it through a word cloud. Then we found it made more sense to distinguish verbs, what will the Labour Party do, from the nouns of who and what they want to do it to. And it kind of produced some interesting results. In the verbs, the word that comes up most is ensure, followed by support, which I think tells us something about the tenor of a possible Labour government. It's all quite safe language, much more about reassurance than radicalism and change. And the nouns are about work, people, services that come through the most. We do see the words local and government come out strongly, which is very relevant to the world of economic development. But it's also interesting what's not jumping out. We don't really see the words industry or transport, and definitely not the words levelling or rebalancing or actually even regional. So this isn't anyway a scientific analysis. It's a couple of word clouds, but it hints at some of the language and priorities that the policy commissions are coming up with. So we've took that and identified 8 things which we think a Labour government will do around economic development. This is our interpretation, just some of the key messages. We tried to translate what it means and have some initial thoughts on what it means for IED members and our type of work in economic development, but it is just an interpretation. Number 1, perhaps a less than cheerful message, is that don't expect lots of new public funding for economic development. There's a clear mantra and theme across these policy documents about stability, about fiscal rules and containing public debt. It's really how they framed the economic and finance policy. That does leave some wriggle room, though. The arguments about only borrowing to invest
And then that leaves questions about how we define borrowing or how we define investing. And when it is about investing, it's about the language of public services and infrastructure. So those are the themes much more than about tax reductions or even about spending on social security and transfer payments. So that gives us the message that there are going to be continued constraints on funding. And with that, I need to demonstrate that public investments are good ones and generate an economic and social return. So perhaps be prepared for continued business cases and green book style appraisals to access funds. I think the second issue that comes out is that given there's likely to be a lack of spending, a new government is likely to look for reforms in institutions and governance. In particular, we've picked up on that includes reforms to planning to support renewable energy, in particular making it easy to build onshore wind and solar farms. But also reforms around establishing an industrial strategy council. Until recently, the current government had an industrial strategy council. Labour want to bring it back, but it seems with a much more beefed up role in setting industrial policy and industrial missions. And also points out they're going to establish Skills England to oversee reforms in English skills provision and further in higher education, which has echoes of the previous Labour government, where there was the UK Commission for Employment and Skills doing this kind of thing. So overall, this implies a much more interventionist approach to industry and to energy and to skills provision, although what's been said about these reforms is much less clear on things like infrastructure and housing. Third one we picked up on is there's clearly ambitions for reforms in planning and housing. What they've said is that they'll be revising the national planning policy guidance, though it's not quite clear on how, but the emphasis seems to be much more on reforming purchasing rules and compulsory purchase orders to support strategic development. And also indicated plans to reform and repurpose Homes England around placemaking and strategic and regeneration, though again, not quite clear what that repurposing of Homes England will really take, what form it will take. But our interpretation of it really points to creating conditions for more active state involvement, particularly in strategic housing sites. Some Labour figures have talked about things like new towns, but again, there's no details on that policy. And there's always going to be questions about how does a reform beefed up Homes England fit with the world of devolution and city mayors, who actually has the decision-making powers. But overall, we can expect to be adapting to a much more interventionist approach in housing and land supply than perhaps we've seen in recent times. The fourth one is to expect more English devolution reforms. And this was certainly a big thrust of the review led by Gordon Brown. But again, details to be seen, and certainly a sense that the devolution that does happen will come with strings attached. There's lots of reference to conditions around strategies, plans, and partnerships. So Labour has said they'll introduce a Take Back Control Act to give towns and cities the tools to develop their growth plans, but not necessarily being clear what the act will include around what increased powers to mayors and regional leaders will be. There certainly seems to be a focus on maintaining the combined authorities and the metro mayors to promote new partnerships, and that points to a clear intention not to return to the regionalism and RDAs and assemblies of the Labour government, of the last Labour government. There's kind of consistency there, and that they'll be keeping the structures that have emerged in recent times. And then there's much talk of developing that relationship between central and local government. Again, less specifics on what that will involve, but messages around a move away from deal making and that constant negotiation that's perhaps happened in recent times. But that lack of detail makes it unclear, and it leaves big questions on how much there will be genuine devolution and decentralisation, and how much may be responding to the goals and targets of central government. But again, pointing to much more consistency in terms of budget allocations and processes rather than these frequent devolution deals and growth deals and so on that have been the form of recent times. Fifth, we picked up on is there's a clear intention to move away from competitive bidding and competitive pots of funding. The recent things like the Levelling Up Fund, the senior Labour politicians derided those as being like the Hunger Games. There's a clear desire to move away from that approach and have much more stability in funding settlements for local government. And that echoes what happened in the 97 Labour government, where it moved away from things like the single regeneration budget, which is competitive, to more kind of formula-based approach rather than bids. But I guess the conditioning on that, if we're not writing competitive bids, it's going to be much more set on these kind of local plans and economic growth and prosperity plans that government signs up to. So perhaps for IED members, it's going to be less about bid writing and filling in those forms of competitions and much more about having clear strategies to justify government investments, and with that, the indicators going to be used and monitoring and evaluation. So it may change the nature of our work in that sense. And six, a focus on green investments. Again, always questions about what the word green means. But the focus that seems to be coming from Labour is around the public energy company, GB Energy, that they intend to set up, which will be a state-led investment vehicle, particularly for onshore, offshore wind, hydrogen projects, and things like carbon capture and storage. And then also they make much about making better use of things like the UK Infrastructure Bank and British Business Bank. Those two institutions already exist. But Labour have been very critical about how they've not been used appropriately or really driven growth or targeted in the right places. And there's a clear intention to make much more use of those. So that implies collectively that the GB Energy, these state banks, if you like, will become much more the mechanism of supporting investment or leveraging investment with the private sector, which helps keep big investments perhaps off the public sector balance sheet. And so really, I think for all of us, I think it's going to be a case of understanding what all these kind of institutions mean, because they're going to matter, and how do we work with them, because it seems to be that will become one of the key vehicles for economic development funding. 2 more to go. Number 7 was there's a commitment to abolish business rates, which is perhaps a big deal. The Labour see it as an outdated system of business taxation, and that by abolishing it, reforming it, it's part of their support for high streets and they want in town centres, and they want to have a new system that incentivises investment, promotes businesses in retail and so on, and uses empty properties. This one's interesting because there's not much detail, but it is a massive reform, and changing it creates sort of uncertainty about what comes next, especially as now over a quarter of local authority revenues comes from retained business rates. That's been one of the changes of the current government. It's much more part of local government revenues than it used to be. So that opens all sorts of questions. Is that the best way to support the high street, or are there other things that could be done? And there's implications for what councils and the rest of us will do around the reform of business rates. So high streets, town centres are a priority, but perhaps one of the things we need to think about as IED members is what that reform of business rates will mean for local government finances and local economic development. And finally, number 8, certainly one of the most interesting until last. One to really watch is this kind of redefining economic strategy around the language of the everyday economy. This really comes through in Labour's industrial strategy, where there's less about high tech and research and development and advanced manufacturing and so on, but much more about what they call everyday sectors like social care and healthcare. And that ties in with the workforce policies around things like a New Deal for working people and ambitions to tackle low pay and improve training. So really that kind of, not completely new thinking, but it implies a new thrust in thinking, which builds on ideas that have come from think tanks and some local authorities, which are focused on things like the foundational economy and the inclusive economy, and perhaps mainstreaming that a lot more, putting things like social care, leisure, local services, and their benefits as part of an industrial strategy. And so as IED members, we need to continue to involve that thinking and perhaps think about economic development more in those terms. And it takes us back to those questions on how we define areas like economic development and regeneration, and how to join up with the everyday of schools, care, local services, when we're talking that language of productivity and investment and skills. And that's me coming to the end of the slides. The 8 takeaways of what Labour will do. Don't expect lots of new funding for economic development. Looking for reforms in institutions and governance rather than lots of new spending. There's ambitions for reforms in planning and housing, but need more detail on what that involves. Expect English devolution of reforms that will come, but with various strings attached around strategies and plans and so on. More clearly moving away from competitive bids, green investment through this public energy company and reforming the state banks, commitment to abolish business rates, and then this one to watch around redefining of economic strategy around the everyday economy. And with that, I think I'll invite Nigel back, and what's the best way to host or to ask questions and open discussion online? If Nigel's still there.
Damian, you've got a question from Robert.
Okay.
Robert saying, could you define what you mean by growth, please?
Okay, so I can't see the questions coming up because I've got my slides up. Define what I mean by growth. Oh, that's always an age-old question, but I think in the simplest sense of the word, GDP growth, that's what government's often focused on, whether that's through population growth, employment growth, or increased productivity. But I think that's what's going to come through this final point in the everyday economy. I've always questioned GDP as a metric, but it's one Treasury and public bodies use. But I think it's that sense of how you increase prosperity and well-being for citizens. But it's how whether a new Labour government will define it differently from a current government will be something we'll see. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah. That's of a okay, I'll stop sharing and I might be able to see any questions that come through.
I think from what's emerged so far from the Labour Party, obviously we haven't got a manifesto, but there's elements of adherence to what we've suggested from an IED perspective in terms of the IED manifesto. Obviously this, I suppose, obviously devolution and greater devolution is one thing, but then also around more certainty around funding. So veering away from the competitive bidding process, which has taken place, say, over the last 2 to 3 years, to create more certainty for local authorities. And that's not to say local authorities won't require support, because they probably will. But certainly, I think having more certainty around funding and what funding is available would definitely make a difference and create more stability. And then obviously there's the aspect of net zero, which Labour have focused more detail on that aspect than, say, other things which you could say lack detail at the moment. So there's obviously quite a bit around that, which again fits with what, from an IED perspective, we're talking about in relation to net zero. So there's quite a bit of adherence there to, or alignment with what IED is saying in its own manifesto. Got some more questions coming through.
Yeah, but RDAs and LEPs. Yeah, I think in one of the documents was a clear statement that regional development agencies wouldn't be returning. I think it's accepting that combined, the structures of it emerged, combined authorities and the metro mayors, and evolving that. I think that return to the kind of the 8, well, Greater London still as it was, but I think it's unlikely we're going to see those kind of 8 government regions that with the structure of the RDAs and the assemblies returning. And LEPs, when they talk about new partnerships, I know the status of LEPs at the minute is kind of being evolving or being wound down. But I think it'll be much more how that kind of ties in with metro mayors, combined authorities, what other new structures emerge in that kind of patchwork quilt we have of governance in England. And then, how might business rates reform work? Thoughts and options, I think. I'm interested to see others' thoughts. I don't know. I think Labour's proposals are currently vague. I think my instinct would be to look up the likes of what the Institute for Fiscal Studies have said on this kind of stuff. I know there was the Merleys review quite a long time ago, but that had all sorts of interesting ideas on local government taxation and land value tax and that kind of stuff. I think it's a thought. I think any local government finance reform is always a difficult topic. Last time there's a big change, I guess, was when the council tax came in, or the poll tax came in the early 90s, and it was contentious, to say the least. So I think, I genuinely don't know what they'd move to. You could just abolish it altogether and have increase corporation tax and get tax businesses that way.
Definitely a need for more detail, isn't there? Because especially with the increasing amount of Section 114s coming about and local authorities continually becoming, greater under threat of bankruptcy. So establishing more certainty around those sorts of funding, whether it's be business rates or something else, is definitely required.
Yeah, because part of the business rates retention reforms of recent years was to create incentives for local authorities. The way to get money would be to give permission to new businesses opening up and so on. And so if any reform to that would affect that incentive and therefore very much change the incentives local authorities have. So if you did say abolish it and just put on corporation tax, say you've centralized it and lost what's one of your few direct systems of local taxation and local incentives. But it's vague. Yeah. And,
Stuart's asked about defining what you mean by the everyday economy.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Labour Party's definition, not mine. I think what they're getting at is that if you go back to the world of RDAs, that was the previous Labour's industrial strategy was often you pick your top sectors. Every area had biotech, creative industries, advanced manufacturing, and that kind of thing. That was the thrust of industrial strategy. And things like health and education, social care was seen as, they didn't really feed into that. You didn't see those so much in the priority sectors of RDAs, where this seems to be more of a different way of thinking. And so I think things like New Economic Foundation and IPPR have done kind of lots of work on this, and Claire's. But it's how you change that what economies locally depend on really is what most people work in is your healthcare jobs, your schools that teach your kids, your childcare services for your nurseries. Increasingly with an aging population, that social care sector, that's a big part of this. It's often seen as underpaid and under-resourced and so on, but actually you get your social care sector working, that's essential for society because people can do other jobs rather than care for sick or old relatives and so on. So I think that's what they're getting at. It's a whole different. It's mainstreaming that economic growth isn't necessarily about your high growth sectors. It's about the more foundational supporting sectors. That's how I interpret it. But I think that's where there's going to have to be a lot more thinking.
Yes, you'd like to think it covers key workers. Key workers didn't really feature in the 2023 budget. And it's a bit of a omission, well, probably a deliberate omission, but it'd be good to see that feature a bit more predominantly, I think.
Yeah, it'd be a big change in thinking. Yeah, but yeah, that's one to watch the space on that one, because I think it's an interesting idea, and it would be big changes in government, because when you've had economic development policy led by Department for Business in its various forms, that's not how they think about economic development. They think about attracting inward investment and high-tech firms, where in government that would see the role of Department of Health and Department of Education as much more part of local economic growth. Let's read Andy's question. Fast-paced change on capacity of the civil service. Yeah, I think that's a big question. I think we'd observe that the civil, well, form follows function, doesn't it? The civil service can grow again. We would say that in recent times, civil service and local government have faced big cuts, constraints in who they can employ, and that's facilitated the growth of consultancies, doesn't it? Whether it's the likes of us, AECOM on the more engineering infrastructure side, or the management consultancies, to fill in that gap. So I think a new government will have a choice, really. Does it try and expand the civil service again? Or does devolution mean you don't need to do that? Because what you're actually expanding is more your local government, city, region kind of delivery. Or do you try and outcontract it all? Yeah, I think it's going to be, growth in these ambitions will require more. You need people to deliver it, and that needs paying for. So initially there will be capacity constraints. It's how much you invest in it. I think, as the question indicates, there's not capacity to handle more than a couple of devolution deals at any one time. They want to move away from deals and just have more consistent funding structures. So that kind of may tidy that one up a bit.
I mean, that might be where the private sector does come in to support the public sector, in the sense that you do have more funding certainty, but undoubtedly there may still be existing capacity issues to deliver things, to deliver projects. So maybe there's a need for more relationships in that regard, rather than going through the whole competitive process, because if you get the allocations process, you then need to worry more about how you're actually going to deliver schemes and initiatives.
Absolutely, yeah. And then one from Helen about moving away from competitive bidding, and will that focus more money on the core cities? I think possibly. It depends what you do instead of competitive bidding. It's like, we know the competitive bidding process sometimes had its own distortions and biases in there. We don't know other mechanisms they'd use. I think learning from the previous Labour government, that's where things like indices of multiple deprivation actually became core ways of allocating funding. That's what determined things like Neighbourhood Renewal Fund. I remember working Neighbourhoods Fund and the New Deal for Communities partly as well. So you may see a return to that kind of approach of using a mechanism like the IMD, maybe something else, but some kind of more formulaic approach to allocate your funding. That does raise issues talk about smaller towns and rural areas. Because I remember one of my early projects, there used to be the Countryside Agency, and they were always worried about biases within the indices of deprivation affecting funding. And I remember doing some work on that. Actually showed there was a slight rural bias in it at the time. But that kind of thing is always an issue, that if you're competitive bidding can be accused of being unfair, but any kind of formula approach can also have accusations of being unfair. So it depends how you design the formula, I guess. And it may favour core cities, but it may not. It depends where the need is and the concentrations of deprivation are and what issue you're trying to address. The next one, well, for you, Dave, on the IED manifesto.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, one of our main things in the IED manifesto is to make economic development a statutory function. Obviously, to even enable that to happen will require quite a bit of liaison. Yeah, I mean, we can only try. Obviously, we have certain strategic relationships, and we can obviously push for that. I think it fits and aligns nicely with the potential greater devolution agenda. So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a a key thing that the IED is keen to be doing.
I think the next one's on the everyday economy again. Yeah, any sector could be regarded as everyday. And is it the foundational economy? I think my answer is I don't know. I think it's a case of going back to some of those ones that I've researched at this point. Well, like I said, the think tanks like Claire's Centre for Economic Studies, is it? No. And yeah, New Economics Foundation, IPPR, they've been pushing this kind of things for a long time. Cities like Preston, towns like Preston have often been held up as kind of something that pioneered some of that work. Newham, I know somewhere that's kind of had an inclusive economy kind of strategy. Parts of Wales have kind of done this foundational economy thing. So yeah, I think it's all part of that. And yeah, I think the challenge is that how do you prioritize your economy if it's every day? Does it mean everything? But at the same time, I think it's more I don't know. I think it's just kind of changing it so it's not about targeting inward investment of manufacturing sectors, everything else. It's kind of understanding what supports the local economy, and I think it's particularly social care, childcare, education, maybe local public transport. I think it's thinking about the services that people actually use that enable an economy, a local economy, to function.
It's definitely aligned with the devolution again, and I suppose it's ensuring key services are supported, but it's also supporting local authorities directly around ensuring they have the skills to deliver and capacity, obviously. Just to say, Damian, there's some more questions on when you reach the end, there's a set of questions on the Slido.
Okay.
The apprentice has just mentioned. I'm gonna have to leave you to it, but
Okay.
thanks for the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll stay on longer for everyone and try and help field some questions. And so what else have we got? Is there any particular infrastructure that Labour should focus on? That Labour do focus on? I think what comes out so far is green and energy. Yeah, we weren't getting much in the documents on transport and digital. It's much more around green infrastructure and wind, solar, and related things around carbon capture, that kind of Ed Miliband-esque kind of influence on policy and the kind of agenda he's been leading for the Labour Party. Then again, the everyday economy, what is going to provide growth? I think it's that, and like I said, these are things we need to think about. I think it's that issue that if you look after your everyday economy, support people's care needs or health needs, and childcare needs, then the economy starts to look after itself a bit because people are healthier, their well-being is better, and therefore become more productive. And then a similar point, challenges it no longer afford higher paid jobs, drive up average pay levels, possibly. Again, these are the things we need to understand. I think it's something that Labour have certainly latched onto this word. Another word that's come up in Rachel Reeves' things is securonomics. I think it's a similar thing. I think everyday economy is a little bit more catchy. But I think that's the kind of, if we're going to go away from this, I think what does it mean for economic development? I think understanding this everyday economy is something we perhaps need to have a better understanding of. Right, Slido. I stopped. I'll have to go back to my presentation on that. So I'm having Zoom issues. Yeah, let's go on the last slide. Oops. Okay, further deeper. Okay, oh, yeah. What do you think will happen with Scotland? Again, we could discuss that. Your understanding is as good as mine. It's and I think it depends on what happens to the government within Scotland. At the moment, we have a SNP government in Scotland had for a long time. It's whether the UK, a resurgence in Labour within England and Wales also means resurgence in Scotland, and you get a Scottish Labour government. And I think that would shape the nature of devolution. Devolution there, you probably get something much more around devolution rather than about negotiating the path to independence, if you like. But yes, that's bigger politics than kind of I know about anyway. Whose everyday economy with a focus? Again, I can see this is a theme that's come up a bit. I think understanding this everyday economy matters. Is it? I suspect it's more about just deprived communities actually, because I think those who aren't deprived also rely on public services in education and health and childcare and so on. So I suspect it's more than that. And I think the point about local shops and takeaways and betting shops, I think that ties in with the future of the high street and so on. So I'm sure we've all got views on that. What is the future of the high street and the town centres? And from a funding perspective, how may these projects be funded? Again, that's a challenge for the next chancellor. There's this desire to balance budgets, fiscal credibility is the message they keep bringing forward. But I think there's two things. I think one, there's that they've stated they'll invest to borrow to invest. So I guess it's how you define borrowing, how you define investment. And like they also say, there's been this kind of off public sector balance sheet ideas around GB Energy and state-led banks like the UK Infrastructure Bank and the British Business Bank, which we need to understand, because that will be the mechanism for leveraging in funds without it necessarily being directly on the public sector balance sheet. Okay, so we can scroll down for more. Okay, the challenges facing underperforming places have not changed hugely in the last 3 decades. Most of the observed gaps have widened rather than narrowed. Why? That's a whole other seminar. And there's greater economics minds than mine who studied that. I think my take on it, for what it's worth, is England and the rest of Britain has got a pattern of urban settlement that's really shaped in industrial times in the Victorian era and early 20th century. And as the economy's changed and it's become less about those old industries and mining and cotton and steel and everything else, you've got this legacy of those old towns and people and jobs that moved there, and those jobs have moved away. And similar with coastal towns, people used to go on holiday to your Blackpools and your Skegness's, and now they've got to Spain and Greece on holiday and so on. So I think it's that legacy of historic places that haven't necessarily been able to find a new rule. But there has been changes certainly in the cities, which have perhaps been more adaptable, because you get the agglomeration arguments come in and been able to bring in new people and have different kinds of economies. I hope that partly answers that question, but it could be a whole other whole other debate. Do you think there'll be a growth in ED jobs and importance for the autumn statement? I've not really kept pace with today's autumn statement because of I was prepping this, but it's possible. Yeah. Relative to other domestic international priorities, do you get a sense of where local economic development levelling up ranks, having read the material? My impression was this is unfair. I think it's more evolving. It's not as upfront as it was, say, in the 2019 Conservative Manifesto, where the phrase levelling up really caught on. It's more understated than that. And I think it's this language of the everyday economy comes through more. And I suppose the argument is that if you support those public services that people are using and disadvantaged people are benefiting from, then that raises your economy in those disadvantaged areas. I think that's where it's coming from. What I and we've not really picked up on is things explicitly around regional convergence and changing the balance of GDP and that in different parts of the country and that kind of stuff. There's certainly nothing explicit on that. And why would there be in a way? Because if Labour tried to secure votes all over the country, they probably want to avoid. When you bring back your red wall and take seats down south as well, they're probably going to try and avoid that picking places, I suspect. And then I think we did the funding perspective one. I think, is that everything? I think that's all the questions, I think. So I'll end the slideshow again and see who's still on the call. Okay, have any more questions come on here? Oh gosh, a few more. There's a few more questions come through, and I'm on my own. I find it's quite strange doing this one. I can't see people, you can't interact directly with me. But what ways do you think Labour will strategically attribute to economic development when balancing planning decisions? Oh yeah, that's another good question. That's something that's not come through. Like I say, I think there's a focus on energy and the low carbon agenda. So in that sense, we can probably expect that planning decisions will be much more liberal, that's the right word, to things like onshore wind and solar farms. That's likely because you can't meet your energy transition that the Labour Party want, your green investment, if your planning decision works against it, if your planning policy just works against it. So I think that will weight it in that direction. And the other big one, obviously, is housing and how you get your housing supply and where you get it. And I think that's always a political hot potato in terms of greenbelt and all that kind of thing. So I think it's one to watch, to be honest, and it's how they balance that out. There are messages, like we said in the presentation, messages around reforming the planning system, but not really clear what those reforms will be, and messages around devolution, but again, not clear what there will be. So it's part of it, a devolution of your planning system. Yeah, especially around major infrastructure and big housing sites and so on. So yeah, watch this space. And any thoughts about the Labour take on the new concept of economically inactive people rather than purely benefit claimants? Wasn't picking up on that in the things we've read. So honest answer on that is don't know. But I think this question is getting at the issue. I think I need to check the latest stats on this, but the rise in inactive people, particularly in the 50s, 60s, where there's been an increase in inactivity within that age cohort, especially post-COVID. And I think there's been some interesting analysis done on the division in that, those who are becoming inactive because they're retired early, because they've got good pension pots and housing wealth, and those in that age group becoming active from ill health or that division, the lifestyle choice, if you like, and barriers to work through health or other responsibilities such as care. So it's a complex picture what's driving that, or a mixed picture what's driving that inactivity. But either way, it's a cost to the economy because people are leaving the workforce. So I expect Labour will try and entice some of those back, but it's how, and maybe it's that everyday economy argument is part of that, especially around things like care. But again, let's see how that develops. Okay, I think that's it for questions. Have I answered everything? Somehow communicate with me if I've missed anything. I think there's still a healthy 46 participants on the call, which is great. Many thank you to all for staying so long. And I've enjoyed talking about this stuff because I'm interested in it, and I think it's a genuinely important thing to think. What is the change going to be? What will the next government, assuming it's likely to be Labour, what will they do? And I think it's helpful to look ahead of the curve a bit to kind of think what that may be, because I worked through the 2010 change from Labour the other way to Conservative, or coalition at that time, and there were big changes, and some of those happened very quickly. The speed with which things like RDAs were abolished and regional assemblies were scrapped was at a pace that I think few people, certainly the civil service where I was expecting. So I think if the government changes the way again, I think the interesting will be how fast, but what are they going to do, but also how fast they're going to do it, and things could possibly change quite quickly. But we live in interesting times, and we'll see what happens. Okay, thank you. I think questions have stopped. I'm happy to stop. Oh yeah, a few things. Yeah, can you make your slides available? Yes, I'll try to. I'll speak with Nigel and the IED about how we circulate those. And yeah, thank you for all those saying it's been interesting and insightful. That's it's reassuring because I can't see you interact with you. It's an unusual way of speaking, so I'm grateful for your feedback, and I hope you've all enjoyed it. Okay, thank you all, and I'll say goodbye. I can see everyone's signing off, so yeah, thanks all, and enjoy the rest of your days. Take care. Bye.